The Art of Being Ruled. Wyndham Lewis. Original publication 1926. 1989 edition. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 5. Natures and Puppets. Chapter 3. Super Freedom of the Revolutionary Rich. The instinct for the supreme condition of freedom which is at the bottom of every great revolutionary movement today could be explained, then, by some such axiom as emancipation and irresponsibility are commutative terms. But behind that are arrayed two schools of thought, or theories of happiness. One is practicable, the other is not. One will no doubt establish itself in the future into which the world is moving. The other is merely a phenomenon of transition. When these popular movements of thought, expressing themselves as highly infectious fashions, are described as theories, it is not meant that they are a body of formulated social doctrine, of course, but rather an instinctive and unconscious process, which is only a theory, properly speaking, for the observer. But from the Lucretian watchtower we are possessing for the moment we are able to formulate for ourselves this pattern of instinctive behavior observed, into an intelligible system of life. The theory that has, of the two, been described as an ephemeral one is far too good to be true, to start with. Also it is a corruption of the old, rather than an entire convert to the new, libertarianism. This is the distinction that we have constantly to make in dealing with Western society today. We are in a mixed society, destined eventually to separate itself out. Of this mixture many corruptions and mongrel forms spring up. Almost every variety of mixture is to be found. In the heart of this new doctrine of freedom, then, there is a cleavage, rather like that other cleavage that produces the doctrine of what the public wants on the one hand, and revolutionary idealism on the other. One is a corruption or caricature of the other, an accommodation between the old and the new. Both types of freedom are to be found in the West, side by side and often confused, and one rather compromised by the other. The disciplined fascist party in Italy can be taken as representing the new and healthy type of freedom. Perhaps it is simpler to discriminate between them by saying that one is political and the other is social. Where the political one does not yet properly exist, a social precursor, cheap advance copy, social caricature of it exists. What is happening in reality in the West is that a small privileged class is playing at revolution, and aping a proletarian freedom that the proletariat has not yet reached the conception of. The rich are always the first revolutionaries. They also mix up together the instincts, opportunities, and desires of the ruler and the ruled. They have the apple and eat it plan in full operation in their behavior. It is they who have evolved the secondary, heterodox, quite impracticable notion of liberty which it will be our especial task to analyze. This type of freedom, synonymous with irresponsibility, and yet impregnated with privilege as well, is a very strange growth indeed. It will be found on examination to be the most utopian type of all. It is only achieved sometimes by one category of creature, the human child, in a lesser degree by the young of animals. But any one not a child attempting by some ruse or other to secure it, seldom can succeed, for the simplest and most inexorable law of nature is there to frustrate such a plan. But it can be successful under special and very artificial conditions, in consequence of the protection and assistance of some other factor that is the equal in power of the natural principle that is challenged by it. As an instance of this, we can take the case of an old, rich, and pampered invalid lady who succeeds in attracting to herself, by means of her riches, all the advantages of childhood. She in this way may arrive at being carried about, waited on, fed, bathed, flattered, put to bed, and in the morning washed and dressed, and so steeped continually in an atmosphere of self-importance. But this is the effect of her wealth, which brings in the element of power and authority, which, though not hers, she is able to use and enjoy. So you must also add to the wealth the advantages of the weaker sex. But the child is the only creature that in its own right, and under favorable conditions, can enjoy unchallenged, and without forfeiting something else that cancels the advantage, this divine irresponsibility, which is the most ideal and utopian type of freedom. The other sort of freedom, or that it is most natural to contrast with this irresponsible variety, is the responsible freedom of the individual in authority, possessing power, position, or wealth, or both. This is a precarious, imperfect, anxious, laborious freedom, but it is the only freedom within the grasp of the average man, except the great patent of ecstatic submission, the feminine type of freedom or self-expression. The type of freedom of which the child is the perpetual emblem, irresponsible freedom, and that other of which the king or millionaire is the emblem, that reposing on authority and power, are both rigidly dependent on other people. They are both obtained at the expense of other people, and the servitude of others is their condition. The third type of freedom, the feminine type, is a parasite of power, and the first requisite for it is a master. There is another sort of very rare freedom, that possessed by the intellect alone. It is contingent on no physical circumstance, is not obtained or held at the expense of others, indeed, is altogether independent of people, and although it is a source of power, is an unrecognized and unofficial source, and takes with it, under favorable circumstances, some of the advantages of irresponsibility, and at the worst, and deprived of all power, still, as freedom, remains unaffected by fortune. But it is not a type with which we need concern ourselves here. It is not as a routed army, but as a triumphant one, that the luxurious, hand-to-mouth, capital-revolutionary society of the interregnum has installed itself in the nursery. Their occult is being evolved by all these highly sophisticated elders, living for sensation, around the figure of a mechanical doll. But, as we have been attempting to show for many chapters now, this mechanical doll, or puppet, is the idol, or at least the symbol, of the great majority of men. It is from them that those privileged groups have stolen it. Their wild nursery devotions are conducted in its expensive shadow. There they eat bread and jam round it, dressed in short print frocks and bibs, sit in demure and silent rows, while one dressed as a martinet scolds them, and then administers shuddering fessees. With costly toys, pranks, and strictly juvenile games, they conform to the object of their devotion, and do nothing inappropriate in its presence. By this particular luxurious Western society, the artist and the child are the two figures most heavily imitated and exploited today. So, of course, both true art and true infancy are in imminent danger of extinction or, worse than death, dishonor. To these two figures should perhaps be added, as a doubtful third, woman. It would be presumptuous, and indeed mad, to suppose that anything could be done, by even the most eloquent disquisition, to change this situation. If, however, one artist, and a single child, are preserved intact and unpolluted owing to my words, I should consider my pains richly rewarded. To a call to protect the children, and in a lesser degree the women, though the women and children must always go together, the English-speaking public would never fail to respond. It is less certain that they would take action if it were merely a question of saving artists and art. It is encouraging for the artist, however, to reflect that the destiny of the artist, in this instance, is bound up with that of the child. Both the nursery and the studio or study are equally and simultaneously threatened, and by the same people. Both are being pillaged and overrun by a vast crowd of grown-ups who covet the irresponsibilities and unreality of those two up till now sacred retreats. To state in its awful simplicity the true inner nature of what is happening, every one wants to be a child, and every one wants to be an artist, which is of course impossible. All the privileges of lisping innocent and petted childhood, and all the privileges of art, are coveted by the masses of the mature and the rich. The mature have developed this particular covetousness because their privileges, the privileges and ambitions of mature life, have been ravished from them. The rich have developed it because, as it is impossible to enjoy openly the privileges of riches in the present period of transition, to exercise power openly, and openly surround themselves with its emblems and satisfactions, as it is necessary to pretend to be merely private citizens when in reality they are the rulers of the world, so they covet the privileges of the artist, to which, and the privileges similarly of the child, they with some reason consider that their irresponsibility affects them. Both the grown-up and the rich man find the natural outlet for their ambition and vitality blocked. Neither can expand upwards and forwards, so they are forced back into these roads that terminate respectively in the nursery and in the studio and study of the artist. That is, put very briefly, but as fully as at this stage of our argument we need, the nature of the threat to art and to infancy. Already a degrading effect can be registered on all hands. It is possible to generalize in the following way as well, that whenever men are prevented from satisfying their ambitions in a full, active, and competitive life, they will loiter on, or, if expelled from, return by the back door or the back window to the nursery. And the rich and powerful, if prevented from indulging their natural taste for pomp and display, which in a socialist epoch is impossible, if prevented from being artists in action, all actions containing naturally a great aesthetic element, will invariably seek to be artists in some other way. Action today is starved of art. That is why there are so many artists and so little good art at all.